Very interesting development. So Dugin has taken up the concept of dark state in contradistinction to deep state or deeper state of globalism or the power Davos, NATO, the power behind um, uh, the CIA and so on. But dark state has a wider application, which he hasn't yet unfolded. Um, it has a homology on um, the concept I've been developing, which is a dominance entity, which is connected to Gramsci's dominazione, or the opposite of hegemony, which is a term which has been generally changed its meaning. In Gramsci, hegemony or hegemony has a positive meaning. It means leadership, and it stands in contradistinction to private arbitrary rule. He gives the example of Piedmont in the north during the Risorgimento, where he says that they only wanted to dominate the country. They did not want to exert leadership. In other words, they wanted to sit comfortably in their homes and in the countryside and live out their lives without being bothered. If it's an English context, you could say snooty lot. They don't want to be noticed. They don't want to be. There's some of that in every country, probably. There's some of that in Germany. I think some German billionaires that don't want anybody to know who they are. Naturally, that's a lot of people consider that an advantage. So the dominance entity would be arbitrary rule by private power as against this dark state power. It would be superimposed on this dark state power, and I think it would be interesting to see how Dugin develops that and how much it corresponds to the Gramsci concept under the transformation of these more than 100 years since, is it more than 100 years? No. Less than 100 years, but almost 100 years since that concept was developed in the context of fascism. So fascism is, in fact, one version of hegemony in Gramsci's idea. And I'll add that another form that's also been developed, it's been most developed, I think, by the Germans, and this is also behind the idea of Führer, El Duce. It just means a leader, right? Or in the case of Führer, that can mean a guide also. It corresponds perfectly to Heidegger. It corresponds perfectly to the thinking of the German historical jurists who realized that, just as Holmes did in America, that if there's a constant development, then justice has something to do with what's possible. And so if the what's possible is constantly changing, then what's just has to be constantly changing, because, for instance, if it's possible to alter the weather, and then the state, rather than intervening and altering the weather to stop a hurricane, will then become unjust. whereas before you couldn't possibly blame somebody for doing that because it wasn't possible. This requires guidance, leadership, and so on. And then you could say there's good and bad versions of this. For Gramsci, again, the positive version of hegemony or hegemon. And there's also, I suppose, to some extent, good and bad versions of the deep state, or this dark state or dominance entity, where the point is that in this fashion that we're now seeing being developed by Trump is that the state is buying into business, and business is becoming more and more with this 10% stakeholding in the futures of advanced chips, for instance. The state is becoming more of an overt arm of business, even though it's already been that for the last 50 years or whatever, sort of covertly. Two paths open up there, one being what was believed at the beginning of the century was this would occur, like in Simmel predicted this, for instance, this would occur, but it would mean sort of the oligarchs would be taken over by the state and turned into a communist state. But it could also happen that you get the state capitalism in a different form than could have been imagined in World War II, as we're seeing with Trump.